Hello and good morning, everybody. I hope the week has been very kind to you folks so far. Lately, I've been looking at studio and one-bedroom apartments in, I would say, halfway decent neighborhoods of Seattle, and I am beyond shocked to learn that living basically anywhere in Seattle is cheaper than Hanover, New Hampshire. Don't get me wrong, I am pleasantly surprised as I am very excited to hopefully move there. But I truly don't understand how that makes sense. Sure, the Dartmouth College is here, but past that... ... Anywho, I've got it narrowed down to about 5 or so places that I thoroughly enjoy, very close to downtown Seattle, and I will most likely enlist the help of my mother to help narrow it down even further. She is great at stuff like that. In the meantime, however, some good old-fashioned true crime today. Our main story will be a bit shorter than I'd like, but that's due to the sheer lack of exposure this case has had, and that's kind of what I look for, so. Today, I bring you the Knight Family Murders. My name is Eli, and this is Murder in the Morning. My sources for today come from Historic Crime Detective, the Dart Review, and Wikipedia. And real quick, that Historic Detective site might be my new favorite place on the internet over Murderpedia or Ranker.com. Every single story I click on is something I've never heard of before, and the articles are enough to get you sucked in and hooked. They're not just like little snippets. And honestly, I can't wait to dive into some more of those forgotten stories that they highlight from centuries ago. For example, today's story. On Tuesday, April 22nd, 1958, 29-year-old David F. Early was freed from Fort Leavenworth Federal Penitentiary, where he had served time for aggravated robbery. In a pre-release letter to the parole board, Early stated that he wanted to return to his home state of Colorado, where his attorney and distant uncle, Merrill A. Knight, had befriended him and allegedly promised to help him upon his release from federal prison. In the letter, Early described Merrill Knight as the, quote, only friend he ever had, end quote. According to historical crime detective, David Early had been in and out of jail or prison for most of his life. In addition to the federal time he served, Early had also served time in Pennsylvania, Oklahoma, and Colorado, where he had completed a prison sentence in 1955 and then another in 1957. He was a career criminal. It was during that time that Merrill A. Knight had become acquainted with his, quote, distant relative, whom he represented in court. Out of pity or a feeling of personal responsibility or connection, this 47-year-old lawyer, Merrill Knight, had taken an interest in the troubled young man who he had invited to his home several times in the past. Mr. Merrill, as you can tell, had a very different life. He married a wonderful woman named Regina who had 2 kids from a previous marriage, 15-year-old Karen and 17-year-old Kenneth. Kenneth. Their family resided in a lofty, some would describe as posh, suburb of Denver, Colorado, and had created a happy and peaceful life there. Unfortunately, their idyllic family life would soon be torn apart most horrifically. After his release, David Early bus-hopped his way from Kansas to Colorado, reaching downtown Denver on April 24th. Here, he registered to stay at the local YMCA, and from there, he purchased a taxi ride to the Knight's residence in the Greenwood area. So far, he was doing exactly what he told the parole board upon his release. However, David arrived around noon, and when no one came to the door, he, quote, entered the house through an unlocked basement door and immediately began going through the home looking for money, jewelry, and any valuable item he could later pawn for cash. When he discovered Knight's .22 caliber rifle in the back of a closet, Early loaded the bolt-action rifle, made himself comfortable in Mr. Knight's favorite chair, and chain-smoked cigarettes as he waited for the family of 4 to return home." End quote. What happens next is a series of acts so vile, you could compare this crime to the Clutter family murders in Kansas years ago, or the more recent case maybe of Chris Watts. Equally disturbing. According to the historic crime detective, Mrs. Regina Knight was the first to return home. With the rifle pointed at her, David Early forced her to a bedroom where he tied her hands and feet. He told her he needed money, and she said that there was $60 in her purse. He yelled at her that it wasn't enough and he wanted more. And more would come. As he was trying to squeeze more and more money out of her, Mrs. Knight's 2 stepchildren walked through the front door. When they saw their father's former client pointing a rifle at them, they were too confused and too shocked to run back out of the house. He led 15-year-old Karen to her bedroom, where he tied her up to the bed with stockings. He then took 17-year-old Kenneth to his mother's room, where he tied him up again with stockings near the foot of the bed. The worst part is knowing that Kenneth alone may have had a moment to escape, but then he would be leaving his younger sister there, and he never expected what this man was about to do. Not long after, Merrill Knight, the final member of the family, returned home sometime between 5:30 and 5:45 p.m. Like the others, David forced Knight into a 3rd bedroom where he ordered his attorney to tie his own feet together. He then told him to lay flat on his stomach, but before he could tie his hands together, he saw Mr. Knight's wallet, took it, found another $127, and put that in his pocket. Then he finished binding the man's hands together behind his back. David would end up collecting another $77 from the family, and then he told them to stay still and he would leave after it got dark. But then something else happened. Unfortunately, we'll never know if David was telling the truth or not about letting that family go. At that moment, Varian L. Ashbaugh, a 47-year-old contractor who had met with Mr. Merrill at his office earlier that day, showed up at the front door with a fist full of documents. David answered the door, and when questioned about Merrill's whereabouts, he told the contractor that he was in the shower. And then he asked where his wife was. Again, David said she was busy. The Knights had previously planned a family vacation to Las Vegas, and they would be leaving in the next day or two. So Mr. Varian assumed that David was there to watch the house. He asked David to hand the papers over to Merrill and left the premises none the wiser. However, during the distraction with Varian Ashbaugh, Knight had gotten loose from his binds and lunged at a surprised Early, who started shooting. Knight was shot 3 times in quick succession and would die on the floor later that evening. Quote, not wanting to leave witnesses behind after mortally wounding the father, David then went to the mother's bedroom, stepped over Kenneth, and shot Regina Knight once in the head. Stepping back over the boy, he went to Karen's room and shot her once in the head. Why he stepped over the boy twice without killing him? Beyond me or anyone. In the short amount of time between moving from one bedroom to the next, Kenneth freed himself and was running out of the house when Early fired one more bullet at him. He missed and the rifle jammed. End quote. Kenneth, the lone survivor, sprinted to his neighbor's house, the Wilsons, and when he reached their porch, he started banging and screaming for help, alerting the neighbors of the murders. The Wilsons, who just happened to be hosting a dinner party that Varian L. Ashbaugh was attending, sprung into action. Several of the men ran outside and noticed a car leaving the Knight's residence, so William Pumpelly and Ashbaugh got into their car and gave chase. Armed with only an empty shotgun, they did the only thing they could. They rammed their car into the stolen vehicle and pushed it into the ditch. Quote, Early jumped out and started running on foot, but was soon overpowered by Pumpelly and Ashbaugh. Others from the party, including Kenneth, soon arrived. And although it's not clear from newspaper reports, it's alleged that someone held the unloaded shotgun on Early. Thinking it was loaded, he stopped struggling, sat on the ground, and smoked a cigarette. Officers soon arrived. as did a newspaper reporter who asked Early why he had murdered the Knight family. Early answered, "Because I needed money." "What for?" the reporter asked. Early snapped back, "What does anybody need money for?" End quote. Immediately, David F. Early was taken into custody at the Arapahoe County Jail, where he confessed twice more, once verbally and another in writing, officially for the records. As attention-seeking criminals do, he immediately agreed to a press conference during which he grinned as the officers described his crimes to reporters. He subsequently allowed a Colorado radio station to interview him that same day. It was reported that David slept like a baby on his first night in jail, and his only request was for more cigarettes. According to Jason Morrow, on December 3rd of that same year, 1958, a jury only needed 25 minutes to return with a verdict of guilty, and the judge would sentence him to death. During the short trial and throughout the appeals, Early's legal battle was fought between psychiatrists for the state and those for the defense. The state would win each time, and Early's execution was set for August 11th, 1961. During his 2.5 or 32-ish months on death row, no one ever came to visit him, and none of his relatives ever wrote him a letter. On his last evening alive, the warden went to his cell and read aloud the death warrant. Early was then taken out and, quote, guided up the ramp to the penthouse where the hexagonal gas chamber was located. He was ordered to strip down and given prison-issued white shorts to wear inside the chamber. After he was seated and strapped into the steel chair, Early said aloud, "I'm sorry I did it." A Catholic priest administered his last rites, and his final statement was, "I hope God will forgive me." At 7:59 p.m., the door was sealed. Quote, 1 minute later, the sodium cyanide pellets dropped into a vat of sulfuric acid. As the room filled with the white gas, Early tried to hold his breath. He lasted for about a minute, then, compulsively, took a deep breath and was unconscious within 10 seconds. 6 minutes later, at 8:05, his body was racked with convulsions, and then he was still for another 2 minutes, and at 8:07 p.m., Early was pronounced dead. End quote. And that, my friends, is the story of the Knight family murders. A bit of a gruesome one today, but again, I had never heard of this. I've Googled familicide or massacres or family murderers tens of times maybe, but I've never come across this until the historic detective criminal until the site I came across that I used as a source, and I will be using that so much more. So thank you to Jason Morrow and every contributor of that website. Again, I can't thank you all enough for your continued support lately. Truly, it's been wonderful. Stick around again for a bonus story with a few new revelations. Okie dokie. Bye-bye. Love you. Whew. Okay. Hello. I don't know how much I edited out of that first portion, but goddamn was I struggling. For these bonus bits, I like to try to highlight recent news, exonerations, updates, etc. And today we are revisiting a crime for which the defendant is now up for a resentencing, titled The Dartmouth Murders 20 Years Later, of dartreview.com. Quote, 20 years ago, tragedy struck the Dartmouth community. The violent actions of two local teenagers left many around Dartmouth grieving their losses and fearing for their safety. Since the founding of Dartmouth, the relationship between the college and the Upper Valley has been one of give and take, and while these events could have been a permanent divide between the two, the local community bonded together, securing justice for the two beloved professors. The purpose of this article is not to relitigate an old case or cut open old wounds, but to remember a story that is too often forgotten in the Dartmouth community. As the 4-year cycle of college is bringing students in and out of Dartmouth, many either forgot or missed entirely this harrowing story. Yet it is ingrained in Dartmouth's past and should never be forgotten. On January 27, 2001, 2 teenagers drove from the town of Chelsea, Vermont to Etna, New Hampshire. Their names were James Parker and Robert Tulloch. After buying special SOG knives, the same type used by special forces during the Vietnam War, they proceeded to the house of Half and Suzanne Zantop, and that's Half. I hope I'm pronouncing that right. The Zantops, married since 1970 and with 2 children, had both emigrated from Germany and met while studying at Stanford University. Half for his PhD in geology, and Suzanne for her master's in political science. The 2 had been teaching at Dartmouth since the mid-1970s, with Half being a popular professor of geology and earth science, and Suzanne the chair of the German department. Parker and Tulloch selected the Zantops' house at random, not knowing the couple before knocking on their door. Posing as students doing a research study on earth science, they approached the Zantops' house intending to gain access to their bank account. They were looking for at least $10,000, which they would use to then flee to Australia. As Suzanne was preparing dinner, Half Zantop allowed the 2 inside. Parker and Tulloch started to ask him questions, and when the 2 did not seem fully prepared for this survey, quote, Half told them as much, angering Tulloch. When the man turned away from the kids, Tulloch attacked him with a knife, fatally slashing him across the chest and face. When Suzanne entered the kitchen, she met the same tragic fate. After killing the Zantops, Parker and Tulloch stole $340 from their wallets and fled, covered in blood. The 2 bodies left at the scene were not discovered until later that evening, when a dinner guest arrived to find the tragic scene. Police originally had no leads or witnesses, but eventually found a footprint and 2 knife sheaths. The knife sheaths were traced back to Parker, who told police that he had bought them with Tulloch to build a fort, but had later sold them. Police left and went to question Tulloch at his home, telling the teen that he was not required to speak with them if he didn't want to. But Tulloch cooperated, however, telling the same story as Parker, that they bought them, were going to use them to build a fort, and then sold them. He even offered up his fingerprints and boots in purposes of matching them. Again, the police left. The next morning, Tulloch and Parker fled their homes, leading their parents to call the police, despite a note that Parker left reading, "Don't call the cops." The 2 drove to Massachusetts in Parker's car before ditching it and attempting to hitchhike to California. At the same time, police put out a warrant for the arrest of both Tulloch and Parker. The pair made it to New Jersey, where a truck driver headed to Indiana gave them a lift west. At some point, while broadcasting their location over his radio, authorities took note of the 2's location, and later a police officer responded, pretending to be another truck driver, and offered them a ride west from Indiana onward. When the pair disembarked at a truck stop, they were arrested and taken back to New Hampshire. Tulloch and Parker were indicted and tried as adults on several charges, even though Parker, who was 16, was still technically a minor. These charges included the murder of the Zantops, and Parker agreed to testify as a witness against Tulloch in exchange for a lesser charge. Tulloch attempted unsuccessfully to be certified as mentally ill in order to evade some charges, but both wound up pleading guilty, Parker to second-degree murder and Tulloch to first-degree murder. While Parker broke down in tears during his trial, Tulloch was emotionless, and refused to look at the Zantops' daughter, Veronica, as she read a victim impact statement aloud. Veronica said that her father's name, translated from German, meant help, and that his generosity and openness were what made this crime possible, making, quote, their deaths seem like the greatest violation, end quote. James Parker was sentenced to 25 years to life in prison with the possibility of parole after 16 years, and Robert Tulloch was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. Both have had their sentences reviewed in recent years, In 2019, Parker asked for an early release from prison. His lawyer noted that while in prison, Parker had obtained a master's degree and had been a model prisoner. His action to ask for an early release was very divisive in the Dartmouth community, with Professor Alexis Jeter of the English department, a close friend of the Xantops, saying that she was afraid of Parker being released. Jeter cast doubt on his rehabilitation in prison and noted that Parker had access to a high-powered lawyer that enabled him to receive a lighter sentence at trial. On the contrary, Phil Pochota, a friend of the Xantops, stated that lifting Parker's sentence would send a message to other inmates that rehabilitation while serving time would be rewarded. Parker later withdrew his appeal and will remain in prison until at least 2024, or this year. Meanwhile, Tulloch's case came under review after the Supreme Court case Miller v. Alabama, in which the court ruled that mandatory sentencing to life without parole was unconstitutional for minors. The New Hampshire Supreme Court ruled in 2014 that Tulloch's case would be reviewed for resentencing. However, as of now, no hearing date has been set, as of that article. Both Tulloch and Parker are held at the New Hampshire State Prison for Men, where it is reported that they have minimal contact. End quote. And that's the end of that article. But now, officially, his resentencing, Robert Tulloch's, is scheduled for mid-July. Just something to keep in mind moving forward. Not saying he does or doesn't deserve a second chance. That ain't up to me, thank God. As for Parker, the article stated he would be in jail at least until 2024, but I couldn't find any more recent articles about him. But maybe I'll do some more digging and keep an eye out for y'all. Anywho, that is all I've got for you folks today. Again, I hope you have a wonderful weekend. Thank you for tuning in. And I will see you lovelies on Monday. Okie dokie. Bye-bye. Love you.